So I don't think we have absolutely everybody that we're expecting, but we do have a large number of people on the call, so we're just going to get underway here. I'm showing what the agenda for the call is, which is just essentially to provide an overview of what the ACT Accelerator is, and to provide an opportunity for those sort of community and civil society reps who have been engaging in various conversations about civil society and community representation on the ACT Accelerator and all of its various pillars and working groups and work streams, the opportunity to let all of you know what they know as of right now, and so that we all have, you know, a broader understanding of what's taking place within this new evolving partnership that's been struck in the last few months. And so I suspect that there is a newer slide than this, but I wanted to just make sure that everyone had the what the ACT Accelerator is in front of them, which is, you know, quote unquote, a landmark global and time-limited collaboration to accelerate the development, production, and equitable global access to new COVID-19 essential health technologies. And as many of you know, this is something that came about quite quickly through the end of March and April, and was sort of formally launched at the beginning of May, alongside the EU-focused pledging conference, I guess you could call it, at the beginning of May, where a large number of countries made pledges and promises to support the fight against COVID. So while, if you go back and look at some of the initial documents, the World Health Organization mentioned civil society as a key part of it. Oh, I'm just getting some distortion, so I'm going to go and mute some lines. Yeah, thanks everyone. So while it's mentioned in the core sort of original documents that civil society would be a partner, if you're like me, you were sort of wondering, but who and where and how and when? And so, you know, a number of people through their various sort of entry points with the different co-conveners, which you know, are listed there under those pillars, you know, started to ask questions about how community and civil society would be engaged, and started to make requests around ensuring that community and civil society were integrated in each of the pillars and across all of the working streams and across the main sort of coordination function of the ACT Day. I guess, and I think that's just sort of enough of an introduction for everyone. What I would say is that we're going to move on to just going straight into updates from civil society and colleagues who have been participating in some of these pillars or in some of the conversations around the overall coordination. What I'm going to suggest is a number of them do have some slides that they're going to share. I know that there will be many, many questions. We have tried to account for a fair amount of Q&A after the presentations, but there will be questions during it. And what I would suggest is if you could use the chat function for any clarifying questions, like anything that doesn't seem clear, as opposed to comments or sort of questions on next steps or anything like that. And if we can use the chat function for those clarifying kinds of questions, then we can try and make sure that after each sort of set of speakers that we try and get those clarifying questions dealt with quickly. I hope that that makes sense to everyone. And so today we do have representatives from, well, we have various civil society colleagues who have been engaging at sort of different levels. I'm going to ask Mike Podmore from Stop AIDS in the UK to lead us off to talk a little bit about the sort of collective of organizations who have come together around broader civil society and community representation across the whole platform. And then we will go into the various pillars, the vaccine partnership, therapeutics, diagnostics, and the health systems connector, as it's now called, instead of, it had been called something else before, but it's now called the health systems connector. So I'm going to start that off with Mike and also Eloise from the Pandemic Awareness Network to provide some updates around some of the key events that are taking place next week. So Mike, if I could pass it over to you to get us started.
Sure. Hi, thanks, Katie. Hi, everybody. Yeah, I'm just sort of giving you this update. I've been working with Katie on this and with all of the delegations that I'll be referring to. So So initially, as the ACT Accelerator was started, there were immediate sort of discussions around the involvement of civil society and communities, in particular with some of the lead agencies, with the Global Fund, with Unitaid, both of whom were supportive of civil society and communities involvement, and initially sort of asked for some ideas and principles about how to do that. And the delegations from the civil society and community delegations from the Global Fund Board and the Unitaid Board started having those discussions about having civil society and community representation, particularly in the diagnostic and the therapeutic pillars. But as these discussions started, it became clear from all of the different civil society community sort of actors looking at this, and particularly the delegations, that we were not making the same progress across all of the components of the ACT Accelerator. And by that, it's been highlighted by Katie, there's the facilitation group, and then there are 4 pillars, the therapeutics and diagnostic pillars, but also the health system strengthening and the vaccine pillar. And so it became clear we weren't making progress in some of these other areas, and that we would need to really write to all of the heads of agencies to really highlight the principle of civil society and community involvement in all of the governance components of the ACT Accelerator. So the delegations of civil society and communities delegations of Global Fund Board, Unitaid Board, GAVI Board, and UHC 2030 all came together to write a first letter on June 5th to all of the principal heads of agencies that are leading the ACT Accelerator. This letter, which is available on the GFAN website, called for civil society and communities to be meaningfully involved and have positions in each of the work streams and each of the components that I've mentioned. That representation should reflect the diversity, expertise, and experience in relation to COVID, for example, across civil society and communities, that there must be a clear process for identifying those representatives, that there might be interim representatives immediately, but then that should be a clear formal process that's open, transparent, and accountable. And of course, that these representatives should be resourced properly. We sent that letter on the 5th, as I mentioned. We have yet to have a formal response from any of the heads of agencies, although we have had some informal responses from, I think, Global Fund, Unitaid, and from WHO, but no formal response. We have heard informally that Unitaid has been leading a sort of a combined response from all agencies. That hasn't come through to us yet, I think in part because we hear that some agencies, and particularly we've heard GAVI, don't actually want to sign on to that common letter back to us. So it would seem that GAVI are providing a bit of a problem for us on this. We then, because we had heard that the principals of each of the agencies are having a call, I think every Thursday, and there was one coming up, in fact, this afternoon, we thought it was important to send a follow-on letter to really just say, let them know our understanding of what progress had been made and where the gaps still were. And so we mobilized to pull together another letter by all of the civil society and communities delegations that was just sent to all their heads of agencies. It was really highlighting that we have made good progress in getting interim civil society reps in the diagnostic and therapeutic pillars, and that progress is being made in terms of also getting reps into the health system strengthening pillar, but they're not there identified yet. I think that CSEM will primarily do that. But then we have no civil society reps in the vaccines pillar or indeed in the overarching facilitation group. We re-emphasized why civil society and community involvement is so critical to ensure equitable access to all COVID-related technologies and tools. we provided more detail on what a formal election process might look like for reps, and emphasized the importance of having a consultation and communication mechanism that supports all of these representatives, that sits sort of outside the ACT Accelerator, and that can really provide a key conduit for broader civil society and communities to be consulted, to input and to share information with these representatives. And of course, re-emphasizing the importance of resourcing. So we wait to hear what comes back from, we hope that they're going to be discussing this on the call this afternoon. And of course, we'll update you as we hear more. That's it from me.
Thanks, Mike. And I just wanted to see if Eloise was able to join us from the Pandemic Awareness Network. I'm not seeing her line. Eloise? Okay. Well, if Eloise is able to join us a little bit later, we can come back to it a little bit, but just suffice it to say that some of the key events that we're kind of, watching for and looking at sort of on this global framework are actually next week, where we expect the formal investment case for the whole sort of the work of the ACT Accelerator to be published around the 25th of June, as long as nothing has changed and I didn't hear. And then of course there's a large global citizen event on the 27th of June, which is primarily, as global citizen events are, to drum up interest and sensitize the public around sort of these key issues and the work that's being done and the need to resource this response. So if Eloise does join a little bit later, we'll come back to this. I'm just looking to see if there are any clarifying questions in the chat, and I'm not seeing any, so I think we will. Sorry?
Katie, could I just flag actually something I forgot to mention was that the letter, as I did mention, is on the GFAN website, but we are sort of asking for all civil society and communities to endorse the letter to show support for this critical.
Yeah, thank you. And I do have a link for that. We'll get one put up in the chat for you all right now.
To sign on individually.
Yeah, so that you can sign on, but we also have a link in sort of our last slide as well, but we'll post that in the chat shortly here for everyone. And so what I'm going to do is just, I'm seeing a few questions in there about noting some upcoming important moments and also civil society representatives in various pillars. And we're going to cover some of that and get updates from each of the pillars. So we'll come back to those questions after some of the presentations. So I know Rohit from the Unitaid delegation is currently on the line, or he was a minute ago, and has a bit of a time stretch today. So I'm going to pass it over to Rohit and FIFA and Courtney, who have been really leading a lot of the work around civil society and community representation within the therapeutics partnership or the therapeutics pillar. So Rohit, could we start off with you?
I apologize. If you can give me 10 more minutes, if you can do the diagnostics first, I will go second. I'm
sure.
Just en route back home, just squeezing this in. Sorry, 10 minutes.
That's okay. Everybody's trying to fit in so many different things right now. So, okay, so that means that you all get to listen to me again. So in terms of, what we will do instead is just start with the diagnostics pillar and come back to the therapeutics pillar in a bit. So on the diagnostics pillar, I just wanted to put up for you all sort of a timeline here. And again, these slides will be available. So don't worry about sort of, understanding it all right now, but it was just sort of a, how did we get here in terms of civil society and community representation within the diagnostics platform and otherwise, and then some of the next steps within the diagnostics platform. So we have shared and circulated as broadly as we've been able to, PowerPoints that have been made available to us. But what I wanted to do was just share a few slides from that so that you could see what some of the structure is. And please note that this is not a final slide. And in fact, some of the language and some of the lead names that are on this slide are no longer current. But overall, this is the structure within the diagnostics partnership, which is 4 working groups and 3 work streams or cross-cutting platforms. They have different names now. But so the 4 main working groups are 1 through 4. The R&D of tests and digital tools, market readiness, supply, country preparedness, and then the cross-cutting sort of themes or work streams are the data foundation and modeling, strategic private sector engagement, and then advocacy and community engagement. And so if you look at these, it's what we have done is we requested, and it was it was agreed to, that we would be able to name civil society and community representatives in each of these 7 spaces, work streams, working groups. And we've done that. As of sort of June 4th, we had provided an interim list of civil society and community representatives. The difference between the 4 working groups across the top and the other ones is that the 4 working groups have a more will have a more formalized structure with terms of reference and sort of more regular calls, like probably weekly or even more sort of regular calls, because there's a lot of big chunks of work that will get done within those groups. Whereas the other platforms, while we have community and civil society representatives named to the other work streams 5 and 6, they will meet a little less regularly. They will have slightly different structures, but we will still have the opportunity to engage in those as those sort of meetings and pieces of work do come up. The advocacy and community engagement sort of platform is meant to be a space for all of the civil society and community representatives who are in the diagnostics partnerships, various working groups and so on, as well as a few other leads to make sure that we have sort of a balance of community and civil society representatives. What's really important to note is that what we have done in the diagnostics one is suggest interim names, and very shortly you will be seeing a call out for an open and transparent process to name permanent civil society and community representatives that we hope will be able to be done and have people in place by the end of August, early September, so that that's done, you know, where we can pull from the broader community and the many different communities who are interested in this work for the longer term of the working of the partnership. I just wanted to share just a couple of sort of slides here as well. I'm not going to go through it all, but there's these basic sort of principles within the partnership, the diagnostics partnership around equitable access, collaboration, evidence-based, accountability, transparency. And then also this slide, which shows a little bit about the roles and responsibilities within the structure. These have been changing a little bit, but at the moment where we are is that the working groups and the work streams have been or are being finalized like in this immediate sort of sense of today and this week. And today later today there is a first sort of full partnership call with sort of all of these different working groups and spaces having nominated and finalized their membership. So I think the really important sort of points that have come up is that the partnerships, they're not legal entities. It has been made clear that with those sort of co-convening lead organizations, in the case of diagnostics being the Global Fund and FIND, the accountability and governance sort of structures of those organizations are what the legal entity is in terms of their participation within it. That said, the partnership within the diagnostics pillar is meant you know, to be a true partnership. They have been making conflict of interest guidelines and those kinds of things, which we were able to input into quite early on, well, as early as we were able to, which was about 2 weeks ago. And that, you know, there's still a lot of, I'm just going to go back to this slide so you can see these timelines again. There's still a lot of overlap, both within the diagnostics pillar between the different groups and between, you know, the other pillars and the health system connector across the whole platform. So there still is a lot that's still being figured out. And so it's really important to have, you know, interim representatives there who can try and grab some of these key and critical issues and speak to them. And so I just put a few next steps there, which I don't think are anything, you know, that should be earth-shattering, but within the diagnostics platform, we're expecting to be sort of looking at soon sort of a budget for the next year of the pillars work. We're expecting to be seeing some initial modeling around the health and economic impacts of testing use cases, which could be as early, I don't think that it's going to be next week, but I think that was the hope. Roadmaps in terms of the work from R&D all the way out to sort of country preparedness and supporting country preparedness around testing. Those roadmaps are being sort of worked out. And as well, the final sort of key component is around the resource mobilization for the work within the diagnostics platform, which will be a part of that larger investment case that will be released next week. And on the diagnostic side, it's pretty meager in terms of what's been raised so far of what they've estimated the need. The investment case for diagnostics is about $6 billion over the next, I think it's 12 to 15, it might be 12 to 18 months. And so far, even with what was pledged in early May, there's 84 million confirmed pledged to the diagnostics. There's likely some more resources there, but it's fairly anemic overall. So I hope that that's a good sort of overview. And again, share these slides and make sure that everybody's able to look at them. I'm just looking to see if there are any clarifying questions. So just to say, I think, Lindsay, there was a question about terms of reference for civil society reps, and it's lovely to have you on the call. I know that there are sort of draft terms of reference for therapeutics. I know that on the diagnostic side, that's sort of one of our next steps, which I think is sort of listed in this slide. So those pieces are getting put together. But like all of you, for many of these civil society and community representatives who've taken on these interim roles, this is being done off the side of the desk. And so, you know, things don't always move as quickly or as, you know, clearly as we'd hope, but we're getting there. And that's our goal. It's not
and Katie, Justin here, I might just chip in as well, but just on that comment or question around TORs for the various pillars, I think to some extent, where this lands depends on a response from the various agencies leading the pillars, because of course we have our own proposals about what we'd like to see. We need some buy-in from the other side as well. And so we're waiting on those responses as Mike has said, but we're certainly pushing it forwards and we'll keep everyone informed.
Thanks, Justin. So not seeing more comments and flags, and those are good. I think we can come back to those. I do believe that the funding split may be a little bit clearer in the investment case next week, but we wait to see that. Rohit, is this a better time?
Yes,
Great.
I am good.
So if I could pass it back to you, Rohit, to give us
Yes.
an update from the therapeutics partnership. And I don't believe there's any slides that I'm missing.
Yes, I apologize about that. So the structure of the therapeutics pillar is similar, I suppose, to the diagnostics and, you know, who knows with the vaccines. So the four work streams are priority setting, market shaping, third is supply and distribution, and the last is sort of financing that is meant to support those other pillars. In terms of representation of civil society, and this work stream is being run by Unitaid and the Wellcome Trust, although it sort of seems it's the Wellcome Trust plus the Gates Foundation, since it's sort of based loosely on this therapeutics accelerator, which both foundations and MasterCard launched even prior to the formation of ACTA. Now, in terms of civil society representation, we've had four of us. So from Unitaid, Kenley, who is the community's representative, and myself, and from the Global Fund, Maureen and Carolyn. And so we have been participating in two sets of calls, one being the coordination platform, and I forgot to mention that there's sort of the four pillars, plus there is the coordination platform that is meant to sort of bring together the different work streams. And we've also been participating, especially in the market shaping. I think it's worth noting that we have not been able to participate in the priority setting, even though arguably that's the most important discussion at this point. And arguably the supply and distribution, at least it sounded that it had not really gotten started, but with the recent news around the dexamethasone, with the recent news around that, it seems that they are trying to sort of get that started. And then just sort of looking forward, the idea is that we would have 6 representatives that I suppose will be distributed across the different work streams, as well as the coordination platform. Arguably, it's, as I'll just mention in a second, you know, the priority setting is never going to stop. So hopefully we can sort of change the dynamics there, because, you know, I think a lot of the decisions as to what to invest in and why to invest in is as important, you know, obviously, as sort of the different interventions that are made to ensure that they're accessible. So some of the issues that we've been sort of grappling with in the first few weeks of engaging here, the first has just been complaining around the conflicts of interest. So, you know, there's a few of the different industry associations, including IFPMA, that sort of is sitting within there that has been uncomfortable, or at least we've tried to make that uncomfortable. So at this point, the only thing they're doing is sort of trying to assess with each call whether or not there's a rationale for excluding them from the call, whereas we'd probably like to have that reversed and have them justify why they should be included. You know, there's also a noticeable lack of LMIC governments or institutions, including PAHO, in terms of their participation. And I think, you know, that's something that's going to have to be improved over time if this is going to sort of be more successful for a lot of countries. I think it's fair to say they don't necessarily have a vision of what they're looking for. I think, you know, given that the way that trials are being run or operational research is being done is sort of throwing everything at this. What you're seeing is a very reactive approach. So they probably have some ideas of what they want, and what they've done is sort of set out some different scenarios of the types of products that they would like to see sort of come through the pipeline, and then how they would respond to that. But for instance, again, with the announcement from the UK with the steroid, all of a sudden on the call that we had this week, there was sort of a lot of activity in sort of trying to think through how to scale up the use of that product, which again, I think carries its risks. I think there's been an underlying issue of how aggressively they're going to look at intellectual property. You know, so for instance, the medicines patent pool is not participating in there. There seems to be a sort of market absence of trying to talk about TRIPS flexibilities. And sort of generally speaking, there was a sort of a bias towards focusing on off-patent or older products versus the newer on-patent products, which is something that we've sort of tried to communicate would sort of not sit well if some of these newer products end up being highly effective. There's also an issue about how broadly this applies. So is this really only an intervention that's appropriate for low-income countries and low-middle-income countries, or are we sort of seeking to ensure that at least the market shaping applies to upper middle-income countries and high-income countries? And one of the disappointments has been this sort of already a sort of light commitment to tiered pricing, which is going to have to be overcome over time. I think there's also a tension between whether or not to focus on just simple drugs versus complex drugs. And so, you know, especially neutralizing antibodies. And again, there's sort of this, that looks really hard to develop or to make affordable and to deliver. So perhaps we shouldn't do that. And again, that's sort of reminiscent of 20 years ago, you know, and sort of maybe how people thought about ARVs. So I think that's going to be an issue that's going to have to be continually tackled to make sure that they are focusing on the most effective products, but also being ambitious. The biggest output, I think, until now is really this investment case, which will be part of the meeting that's coming up next week, and sort of trying to indicate how much funding is required and the sort of different scenarios that they're looking at. I think it's quite incomplete. It doesn't have a lot of evidence attached to it, but it's at least a starting point. And then I think I've seen in the comments some of these issues around the balance of funding. So, you know, right now, all of the money is, there's a dog. All of the money is going to the vaccines pillar. You know, perhaps it's going to change now that there are products that look somewhat more promising for the therapeutics pillar. But, you know, I think whether you're talking about tests or treatments, you know, if we don't get the funding right, and I think this is something that has to be done across the different platforms or the different pillars, then this isn't going to work. The last thing I'd like to stress is, you know, we're aiming for 6 representatives. It's important to see these different work streams as being highly interrelated. That's something that they're trying to flesh out. So even if people are working in different work streams, it's going to be about working as a team across the different work streams, because I think that it's going to be hard to separate out some of the interventions over time. And I'll stop there.
Thanks, Rohit. I just wanted to check in and see if FIFA or Courtney had anything else to add to this update.
No, Katie, I'm happy with that, thanks.
Great. Okay.
Maybe just to add that, yeah, we have actually issued our terms of reference. So there's a call for expressions of interest.
Ah, yes, thank you.
Those 6 rep roles, and I will share it with the GFAN list. So we'd appreciate if everyone could share that as well.
Yes, please apply, because we are very keen to have somebody come in on a more, whatever you want to call, permanent basis by mid-July, in part because, you know, again, I think the engines are really getting started up now that there's some potentially promising treatment. So it'll be really important to sort of get in at the outset, because, you know, obviously this is going to evolve quite rapidly over the next months.
Great, thank you. And I think that that call out has been circulated over GFAN, but we can also share sort of as updates to this call again, and make sure that everybody can see that. It might be hosted on a website. We'll go see if we can find those links while we're having the conversations. So thank you. I'm not seeing any further clarifying questions in the chat in terms of the therapeutics update. So I did want to just to move us along onto the health system connector or health systems cross-cutting platform, whatever it's being called now. And Robin Montgomery from ICAD in Canada is going to give us that update. And so I'm just going to stop sharing this screen and put her slides up. So just give me a second. But Robin, over to you.
Thanks very much, Katie. Hi, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. So as Katie mentioned, my name is Robin Montgomery, and I'm with the Interagency Coalition on AIDS and Development, ICAD, based out of Ottawa, Canada, and also I'm a board member on the Global Fund Board. So as we've been hearing today, some of the areas of the ACTA have been in various stages of development, and not all of the pillars have been moving at the same speed. Some, as we've heard today, are more advanced in their development phase than others. The cross-cutting health system strengthening pillar, which you saw at the bottom of the three pillars, really came into existence after the takeoff of the three vertical pillars of vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics. The health systems connector, as it's called now, is essentially a fourth pillar, and it's just getting off the ground with the first civil society meeting with the co-conveners just happening late last week. So as you saw, health system strengthening is cross-cutting and it connects the three pillars. The co-conveners for this work are the Global Fund and the WHO. So I've just gotten a recent slide deck, the most recent slide deck, just before this call. So I'm going to be bouncing back and forth between those slide decks, and I will update these slides before they are sent out to the group so that everyone has the most recent information. One of the key principles of the health systems connector is that it shouldn't duplicate work being done by the other pillars. And hence that's why, one of the reasons why there's been a little bit of lag in terms of how and when it's gotten off the ground. The focus is that its work should be focused and COVID-19 responsive and relevant, with the goal of identifying critical health systems bottlenecks that are impeding the delivery of vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics. So here we have the two strategic objectives of the health systems connector, which are to identify and strengthen key enablers of resilient and healthy systems, both in terms of community health systems and formal health systems, with a focus on two key areas. The first is really around capacity and infrastructure, ensuring that countries have the necessary infrastructure in place to be able to respond to COVID. For example, we recognize that one of the key priorities is ensuring PPE to all healthcare workers, both in formal healthcare settings, as well as within community settings such as outreach and peer education. Because if we lose our healthcare workers, we are really going to be cut at the knees, not only in our response to COVID, but in our response to other health issues, including HIV, TB, and malaria, and health issues more broadly. The second issue or area that it will look at is really around the systems level. And here it's ensuring that there are innovations and interventions that are available to complement the biomedical tools that will be distributed through the three pillars, and ensuring that in facilitating the the swift delivery of all of those and getting through many of the bottlenecks that we know exist. And then the second objective is really to be that connector across the three pillars and ensuring that there is coordination across the three in terms of delivery systems. Next slide, please. So the next slide is really the guiding principles. What we do recognize so far, and this has been one of the points that we've consistently raised in all of our conversations with the different global health institutions and the co-conveners, is the very apparent absence of voices from the global south. And so this has been identified as one of the key areas, one of the key pillars or connectors where the global south will be playing an increasing role. So we will be making sure that that does happen as early as possible so that voices of the global south are also involved in all of the decision making in a timely manner. Guiding principles, be practical. We know that the health system strengthening is a massive bucket of issues. And to recognize that we can't solve all system problems, so we need to be very focused and very practical in what we are able to do and to measure. Be focused on a functional and efficient delivery of systems for key products. Look at near-term practical solutions. Be country-focused. Emphasis on cross-learning and knowledge sharing, and ensuring that there is an equity lens across all of the different activities. Next slide, please. So here's where I'm going to jump back and forth between the slide deck that I just got, because there are some helpful updates here in terms of where each of the 7 working groups or work streams are currently located in terms of what they've been discussing so far. So as you can see, there are 7 different work streams. And in terms of progress to date, the health financing work stream has identified the following deliverables to be working on. So the first is to assist countries in identifying and prioritizing where to invest. Second, how to mobilize and make resources available at the front lines to deploy tools. Thirdly, creating accountability for financing, for example, using the UHC 2030 Partnership for Health Country Coordinating Platform. Fourthly, learning and knowledge sharing. Second, community-led response workstream. And I've got, sorry?
It's reaction until.
Go ahead, Robin.
Great, okay. So community-led response work stream in terms of the identified deliverables. The first is to leverage existing relevant global initiatives and country platforms for community engagement. Addressing misinformation, looking at knowledge management in terms of best practices, lessons learned, and channeling countries to available resources. So for example, checklists around preparedness and help to organize direct country responses. In terms of the work group around protecting frontline health workers, the immediate priorities have been as follows: to ensure availability of PPE to frontline workers, understanding the gaps, needs, advocacy, guideline implementation, support, and safe disposal. Secondly, to improve basic infrastructure at primary healthcare facilities, including wash, electricity, and connectivity. Thirdly is to support implementation of community-based health services, including scaling up training of workers for frontline services. The next work stream, the fourth work stream, integrated data management work stream, provide useful and readable dashboards for policymakers and ACTA partners. Secondly, to support countries to sustainably strengthen information systems. Thirdly, crisis monitoring. So here really ensuring that there is a watchdog function in place. Fourthly, preparation for the integration of ACTA tools. So identifying countries with limited versus strong organizational capacity to receive and deliver ACTA tools. Then we get into the supply chain work stream. Here, the focus is really on helping to strengthen demand forecast capacities, supply landscape assessments, operational models, and funding needs to help to identify what the funding needs are at country level. Next is the private sector work stream. And here, as you'll see, a lot of these work streams actually do duplicate with many of the working groups in the 3 vertical pillars. So how these working groups are to engage with the working groups in the 3 pillars, it still needs to be worked out. But here, in terms of private sector, we've got private sector mapping, tapping the UHC 2030 private sector constituency members and others for contextual knowledge, and thirdly, identifying institutional capacity needs for better private sector engagement. The clinical care work stream is still working on their deliverables, and I understand will be presenting its progress at the next meeting, which is likely to take place on Friday of this week. So that just gives you a sense of where these different work streams are. In terms of civil society engagement, the civil society engagement mechanism, and I'll hand it over to Eliana in a second, is the focal group for civil society as the coordinating platform for civil society and community engagement. So as I said, this is a rapidly evolving conversation, and it's great that civil society is engaged at this point, but we have only been engaged very, very recently. So it'll be very important that we have our interim reps on these different work streams as soon as possible. So I guess with that, I'm going to hand it over to Eliana to hear a little bit more about civil society engagement and where we are in terms of identifying those civil society interim reps. Thanks.
Hi, it's Justin. I'm Eliana's civil society colleague in the civil society engagement mechanism, and I'm getting messages suggesting that maybe I should respond to that question. So I will follow instructions and do that. Just to say that civil society engagement mechanism of UH is the civil society constituency of UHC 2030. Some of you are very familiar with it, perhaps some of you less so. The structure, which I'll mention briefly because it's a structure that's been recommended for civil society engagement in ACTA and the various pillars, is 3 seats on the steering committee representing Global North, Global South, and community-based organizations, with 3 alternates and then an advisory group sitting behind it. And that seems to be an approach that works fairly well. It is correct, as you've said, Robin, that CSEM has been tasked with finding interim representatives to sort of work within the health system strengthening pillar. That's in its very early stages. We haven't yet had a call with colleagues working on HSS, though I understand one is happening later today. But really the priority, as with the other pillars, will be to ensure that there's a transparent process with transparent criteria so that permanent representatives can be found. I think the challenge in all of this for all of us is that we need to do 2 things. The first is that this process is evolving tremendously quickly, and we need to just have people in there to see what's going on. And then the second is that we need a much more transparent and open process, and we need it to happen as soon as possible to get these more permanent representatives. And so we're trying to do both. So nothing hugely exciting to report about civil society representation in HSS at this stage, except that it's happening. We will have a call soon, and we will be looking to open it up as soon as possible. I hope that's enough of a brief summary. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Justin. And just to say, to date, given that the WHO and the Global Fund are the co-conveners, the civil society and communities delegations from the Global Fund and from UNITAID have been the ones that have been involved in the early conversations, really beginning last week. So we really are excited about CSEM and their new involvement and working in partnership. So looking forward to continued conversation. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Robin and Justin. I'm seeing more great comments and things that community and civil society reps who are in interim spaces to think about. I guess what I would say is these are all, this is all happening so very quickly, and we know so much from our past experience that we just, hope that we can work together over the next, sort of few months, in particular in these critical first few months, to make sure that all of you somehow found out about this call, for example. So when you see something coming out from us around trying to find representatives and spreading that out further beyond sort of our known sort of listservs and communities, that's what we're asking of you. Like, we're asking you to help us do that, because there's no one sort of global organization or one global group that has all of this, set up already. So just for that to sort of be keeping in mind. So I will pass it on to Karar, who is from, I believe, Save the Children in the UK. Sorry, Karar, I'm not sure we got to that part when we were introduced over email the other day, but Karar was going to provide an update from the vaccines pillar. So over to you.
Thank you very much. Just a quick thing, I'm trying to share my screen, but it says you cannot share screen whilst other participants are sharing.
I'm going to stop sharing now, and you should be able to pick up.
Okay, I don't know if you can see anything.
It's up now. Go ahead.
Yeah, perfect. Hello there. Good morning. Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Kara. I'm an Access to Medicines advisor with Save the Children based in London. And I've been asked to speak on the vaccines pillar on our CSO involvement to date. I guess this all happened very, very quickly, similar to the sentiments that were shared in terms of the breakneck speeds that we're seeing some of this stuff evolving. But essentially, the GAVI CSO steering committee was tasked with essentially convening a group of CSO stakeholders to comment on this kind of innovative financing facility that they have been trying to set up within the vaccines pillar. So they sent out an expression of interest essentially for groups working in this space. And they historically looked at organizations that had worked in the previous financing mechanism, which was the PCV AMC, so the Advanced Market Commitment for the Pneumonia Vaccine. So just briefly at the top here, you can see in terms of the vaccines, or in terms of the vaccines, or the ACT accelerator, where the vaccines pillar sits. So essentially, the one on the far left with the development, scale up, and delivery of a COVID-19 vaccines. Within that, there are 3 separate work streams. So you kind of termed the red, yellow, and blue. So the red is essentially the development and manufacturing as led by CEPI. The yellow work stream, which is a policy and allocation, and this you would have heard being termed the WHO's allocation framework, is the yellow work stream. And then the work stream which my involvement has been to date is through the blue work stream, which is the procurement and delivery at scale. And this is where this COVAX facility sits and this innovative AMC financing mechanism sits. So essentially, the consultative group was set up to provide inputs into quite an aggressive timeline of documents. And this was this advanced market commitment for COVID. The group initially was intended to be about 12 members, and it ran from the 20th of May until the 15th, or that was the initial kind of intention. Just to say that this engagement took us up until when the document was actually launched, which was on the same time as GAVI replenishment on the 4th of June. And some of you would have seen this public document, which essentially was the document that we put input into, was published on the 12th of June. I can share that after the call if easier. And just to say, the working group secretariat was led by IFRC, and it was their job to essentially consolidate the feedback from the various CSO stakeholders back to GAVI and the AMC team. The initial, we were given a heads up that this was actually a very, very aggressive timeline for turnaround. They initially said, we're looking around less than 72 hours for each subsequent feedback on each document. So just to give you a kind of gist of the timelines, 22nd of May, we had the kickoff call with a pre-read essentially of what the thinking has been initially in terms of what this AMC or this COVAX facility would look like. They then sent around the meeting notes shortly after with a deadline for close of business for any comments. On the 28th of May, they sent around the technical document, which is essentially the document you would have seen publicly listed or publicly sent out. And they asked for comment, and essentially we had about 32 hours to turn around the document. And you can imagine with all the other competing interests that everyone has on their plate, it's not exactly ideal to kind of give it the headspace or to have the headspace to give this the quality of critiquing that it requires. And as I said, it got launched on the 4th of June, and then there's a public document that most of you hopefully would have seen come out on the 12th of June. This is again, this is a slide I've taken from kind of Kate's presentation, which she'd done earlier for previous CSOs. Just to say that you can see, as I said, the CEPI work stream, the GAVI work stream in terms of procurement delivery, and the policy allocation. Just to say that my involvement and this consultation group refers to this middle pillar, and specifically within the this COVAX facility. And just to kind of reiterate that actually, in terms of even what's going on at the CEPI level and the WHO's allocation framework, there is very little visibility there. Again, this just kind of reiterates the timelines. As I said, it was quite an aggressive turnaround. As I said, this was kind of expressed from the get-go, from the terms of reference that was sent out following expression of interest. So we had kind of been given a heads up, but I didn't quite expect it to be that tight, to be honest. Some of the themes that would just emerge very quickly from that document, some of the feedback, I think there was, natural kind of concerns around transparency and the need for transparency from all parties. This included both the kind of technical discussions that were happening by the various technical partners, but also in terms of some of the bilateral deals that were being struck by country governments, both bilaterally and at a regional level, and also the kind of need to stress transparency from an industry perspective for those that are engaging in this mechanism. I think there was some reservations around the framework for candidate selection. Who and how would that happen? So they expressed that this was CEPI's remit, and that they essentially passed the buck on and said, okay, this is not our remit, this is CEPI's remit. And then there was some kind of questions or reservations around actually what the principles for supply security include, and then what would the diversification of the suppliers mean, what the diversification of platforms would look like, geographic diversity, etc. In terms of country participation, they kind of reiterated that the ambition is for countries to follow the WHO's allocation framework, which I haven't seen to date. I've only seen kind of early principles document of it. And in terms of country buy-in as well, there was kind of issues around actually how do we get all countries to buy into this mechanism versus attempting to pursue a kind of nationalist agenda or a regional agenda, as we've seen with the European Union or the European Commission. In terms of private sector expectation, there was a lot of feedback from the CSOs that actually there was very little in there in terms of expectation from the private sector. They explained that this will be governed by an access agreement, which hopefully should be again informed by this WHO allocation framework. Issues around pricing again, as it relates to the private sector. I think the comment was there's an expectation that there'll be a minimum returns during the pandemic period, and that there's an expectation that private sector will fulfill their supply commitments. But again, because of the very little transparency on R&D costs, what does a minimum return actually mean? Issues or questions around IP. They acknowledged that this was noted. They acknowledged the CTAP or this technology pool that was launched. However, they went on to comment to say, we anticipate that the AMC will operate within the existing IP frameworks in place, which includes several flexibilities, but do not anticipate including requirements beyond the current framework. What does that actually mean? I don't know. I don't know if any of you have any clearer as to what that reply actually means. I personally wasn't. So it looks like, again, IP is one of those components that every time it was brought up, essentially it was passed on. So no one technical agency was happy to kind of have that discussion head on. In terms of procurement, they stressed that existing procurement structures will be utilized. However, some of you who are involved in the middle income country kind of discussions and some of the issues around middle income country affordability will know that the existing procurement mechanisms are far from perfect. We have issues certain kind of reservations around the use of universal supplies division versus national country procurements. We have issues around cost of freight and comparability between the different procurement mechanisms. So they're suggesting the use of PAHO, UNICEF Supplies Division, and through the national procurement. In terms of country consultations, they said that this is both at a political and a technical level. From a political standpoint, trying to gauge country appetite in engaging in this mechanism, and from a technical standpoint, in terms of getting countries to get involved in the subsequent iterations of each version of the document as it comes out. As it relates to governance, they expressed that no new governance structures will exist in principle, and that the existing governance structures will be the mechanism through which CSO engagement can occur. Just very quickly, in terms of humanitarian NGO access, they expressed the existing mechanism of international coordination group allows Gavi-funded vaccines such as meningitis, cholera, etc. And they will look to see if that can inform a future COVID. So that's kind of ongoing discussions whether the existing mechanisms for humanitarian access or NGO access can be also extrapolated to a COVID vaccine. As it relates to health system strengthening, there was a lot of questions or feedback from CSOs as to actually who's addressing issues around cold chain, last mile, middle-income country affordability, surveillance. These issues are long-standing issues with existing immunization programs. They're not all of a sudden going to disappear with a COVID vaccine. They acknowledge this is noted and is being considered under the delivery at scale workstream in the next phase of work. In terms of transparent pricing and public financing, that this is under consideration, and that they're considering what a pricing mechanism would look like. So is it based on the cost of goods, how that means for respective markets or country affordability, vaccine profiles, etc. And they kind of again reiterated this minimum return expectation from manufacturers. But again, that tied in very weakly to transparency calls around costs, etc. So there seems to be a huge disconnect there. In terms of next phase, the last communication we heard, the next phase of consultation to await information mid-June. We're mid-June now, so I'm hoping anything will ping through the inbox anytime soon. And then obviously there's the upcoming Gavi board meeting discussions, which are kind of occurring, and the various Gavi board papers that I'm sure the various agencies will be inputting in bilaterally and also through the CSO group. And then just lastly, a note from this GAVI CSO constituency that the CSO reps have been continually pushing for CSO engagement in decision-making processes beyond this group. That has come in the form of board discussions, private communications with the Secretariat, bilateral discussions with donors, the likes of DFID. And their response has been that they've moved quickly in making the consultation group, and the one I've just referred to, and that they feel this is enough, which again, frankly, is laughable. And that actually, just to stress that so far within the vaccines pillar, we're seeing governance structures as it relates, or this kind of consultative group predominantly relates to the Gavi workstream. However, what on earth is going on with CEPI? What does their governance structure look like? Are they accountable to their board, 12 voting members? In terms of the WHO, actually, well, what's happening with the policy and allocation framework? I haven't seen anything to date. And yeah, in terms of the governance structures there, those discussions seem to have been lagging significantly behind to the Gavi discussions, which are, not the best to say the least. So that's me very quickly. Sorry if I've taken up longer than the allotted time. Thank you.
Thanks, Kara. Really appreciate it. And no, I think this is really important for everyone that we share what we know and what sort of expectations are. I'm just looking.
Hey, it's Amy. Is it possible to just jump in quickly?
Yeah, go ahead, Amy. Sorry.
Thank you, Kara, for that wonderful presentation. Hi, everyone. I'm Amy Worley. I work quite closely with the GAVI Civil Society constituency, and I just wanted to add a few comments to what Kara explained. I think one of the things I just wanted to make clear is the consultative group that Kara was part of, that he described quite well in his presentation. He's right that the turnaround on the expectations of any document was incredibly short. Equally, the turnaround to set up that group was very, very short. We were given, I think, 48 hours to find people who knew about these sorts of issues to be part of that group. That was obviously very, very challenging and meant we couldn't make it as transparent a recruitment process as we would ideally liked. And I think one of the things there is a question mark going forward about whether or not that group continues to exist and what its role is. Now we have this interim design document. And I think one of the things we've been saying to GAVI is if this is going to be a much longer process, then we would like to have a much more consultative and much more transparent process for recruiting the people who are part of this consultation group, because we totally recognise when you only have 48 hours to find people, it's quite a challenge. So, you know, we've been doing what we can do, but it's similar to the other pillars. I think we've all been asked to do things very, very quickly. The other thing I would just highlight is the consultation group sat outside of the work stream plan that Cara shared. And one of the things our delegation on the GAVI board have been pushing is that while it's lovely for civil society to be consulted on this design document, we strongly believe that is not enough, and that is essential that civil society are also at the table where decisions are made. So that's something we've been communicating, as Cara said, and that we've been obviously following up with the other delegations about involvement in the broader vaccines pillar. But at the moment, as Mike pointed out earlier in the call, there is no official civil society representation on those core groups that are making decisions within any of the vaccines pillar, as far as we know. Thanks, Katie.
Thanks, and that brings us to sort of an end of sort of the briefings that we wanted to do, and I wanted to pass it over to my co-convener, Justin, to facilitate a Q&A.
Hi, thanks, Katie. So I'm back. So it's my great pleasure to facilitate a Q&A, and I propose that we spend most of the rest of the call, so probably about 20 minutes before we wrap up on this Q&A. So can I remind you, if you have questions, the best way to facilitate those questions, as many of you are doing, is to put them in the chat. So what I'm going to do now is make sure that we've covered off on basically the questions that people have been asking thus far, to make sure that everything that's been asked gets answered to the extent that we can. And then if we have some more time, obviously we'll take some more questions. And so the first bucket, obviously some of you are reading some of the chat as we go, but just to make sure they're all answered, the first bucket that I can see that really people are asking a lot of questions about is what happens with the funding and the pledges, and where's the transparency on how it's allocated, in particular between the pillars. And I might hand over to some of my colleagues to answer that, but having had a little view of what's going on in the diagnostics pillar, I think it's, to be honest, not that clear, and not even that clear to the organizations that are co-hosting the pillars. As Katie said, so there was this $8 billion pledge at on May 4th, pledging round, and somewhere between there and last week or a couple of weeks ago, there were $84 million sort of earmarked for diagnostics. And so we asked, where is all this money going? And the honest answer from FINE is we don't actually know at this stage. We're trying to unpack the commitments, although a lot of that is for sort of countries pledging for domestic spending. So I think the answer is that it's all being worked out at the moment, and we don't have a better answer than that. Katie or Mike or someone else, do you want to add anything to questions about transparency of funding and where it goes? And I could suggest that any of the speakers want to unmute and just chip in at this point. That's fine. I think that would be a good way to run Q&A.
Hi, Justin, it's Robin here. Maybe I can just jump in. So in the conversations that I've been in within the diagnostics pillar and the health system strengthening pillar, that's been one of our key asks as civil society and communities in each of our meetings. And there isn't clarity at the moment. And you're absolutely right, at least within those two pillars. They themselves, the co-conveners, are trying to get a handle on, or a sense of, the allocation of that first round of pledges. Some feel that it's largely going to the vaccine pillar. although, you know, it still remains to be seen in terms of how much and who makes those decisions.
Great, thanks for that, Robin. So I think I'm guessing that if any of the other speakers were to comment, it would be along those lines. We don't know, and we're trying very hard to find out, and we'll report back as soon as we know. There's also a sort of another bucket of questions, sort of more practical in nature about the working of how these civil society representations and delegations are actually going to work. So what's the commitment? Who can apply? Questions like that. I see that Courtney has posted already the call for expressions of interest for the therapeutics pillar. The others are in development, but I don't know if Katie or others would like to sort of comment on some of those practicalities.
Sorry, Justin, I'm having a hard time hearing you at the moment.
Can anyone else hear me, or is everyone having a hard time hearing me?
It's just a little muted, and it's like you're in a tunnel. I see if there's a way to be closer to your microphone.
Is that any better?
Much better.
Don't know why that happened. Apologies, everyone who couldn't hear me. So this was now moving to the sort of the second bucket of questions, which is around practicalities of civil society representation. So there was a question about what's the commitment for civil society representatives. There was a question about who could apply, and I noted that Courtney had already posted terms of reference for the therapeutics pillar. But if we could just cover off on some of those practicalities to the extent that we know them.
Yeah, so maybe I can just start just in terms of the diagnostics pillar, where where I mentioned that you know, we will be sending out sort of an open call for civil society reps in the permanent space, and we'll be very much basing our sort of process on you know, what the therapeutics has done, and which was launched and has been shared over the chat line here and over a number of listservs. And so as far as the diagnostics pillar goes, the involvement and the engagement of civil society and communities has been really positive thus far, and really open to us saying, you know, look, we need to have at least one person per working group, preferably two, which we do now have, so that there's, you know, backup for people so that people can share sort of the load and come from different perspectives. And obviously we hope that through sort of an open process that we will get to a lot of these other kinds of groups and issues and be able to make sure that we have the right kinds of balance to get to people who are living with or have experienced the disease specifically, who are living with some of the I'm not sure what the right word is, to be honest, but who are living with some of the other health challenges that make, you know, the response complicated or a little bit more you know, challenging, I guess, in a health context, to make sure that we are looking at all of those other issues that we, you know, sort of care about around gender and SRHR and sort of all of these, you know, issues that COVID just kinds of compounds the problems for, right? So obviously, you know, we're never going to be able to have absolutely everybody within that pillar, for example, but hopefully we'll be able to do a good job in terms of attracting folks. And the idea of having interim reps right now was to make sure that we could do a good job of being broad and open about selecting permanent sort of representatives. So from the diagnostics pillar, that's, I think, an update on that. So there's no restriction in terms of who can be selected, right? Like there's no group or groups that are being envisioned to be excluded in terms of society and community groups.
That's fantastic, Katie, and I think that comment leads naturally onto several others that people have made in the chat, which I will get onto now. But let me just check if colleagues from any of the other pillars would like to chime in before that. All right, so I'll keep going, but obviously, please, colleagues, if you do want to come in at some point, feel free. So I just wanted to point along those lines about how we actually determining who the right civil society representatives are. There's a comment from Robin Gomar around, are we paying sufficient attention to to age and gender. There's a comment from my CSEM colleague Javier, also GFAN, about how do we branch out from sort of the traditional global health architecture, you know, for these incredible job being done by organizations like GFAN, like the Global Fund Delegation, Unitaid, GAVI, and you know, CSEM is also involved. But actually, who are the key populations for COVID? And they might not be the key populations for some of these other conditions. And how do we really reach out to the people who need to be at the table and are not necessarily through the processes that we had? There's a comment a little bit further down, I'm trying to find it, from Sophia around the scary numbers predicted concerning access to contraceptives, and whether there's going to be anything you know, in the representation about SRHR dynamics. And I think all of these things are really critical. And it's critical that when we look at permanent representation, well, permanent in inverted commas, it'll probably likely be 12 to 15 months or whatever it is, that we actually figure out who those key populations are. Let me check if any of my other colleagues would like to come in on those comments, any of those comments, or any other questions previously, and then we will move to some more questions.
Justin, this is Mike. Just to add to that, and you know, I put some comments in the chat as well. Is I think both for the interims and the developing TORs, we really need to sort of ensure that we've developed a sort of a set of key sort of perspectives and asks that, you know, that the interim representatives can refer to, recognizing the limitations of the process that sort of put them in place, but giving them the tools to actually, and the different lenses that they need to apply to ensure that the key decisions that are happening right now take all of these different perspectives into account. So that's the first thing. And then I think, obviously, as you say, as we look forward to the more formal process, we need to make absolutely sure that all of these key civil society groups, communities, populations are appropriately represented, but that there needs to be an ongoing process for this broader group of civil society and communities to be feeding in and providing them with the key perspectives and policy asks for their work. But yeah, we need to be working on that right now, because the key decisions are happening now, and many of those may have happened by the time the formal reps actually put in place. Thanks.
Could I raise a quick question about this? This is Asia from Health Gap, just to make that specific point, because that the need through the development of a shared set of demands and a policy agenda, we can get at these key concerns about accountability and robust representation that Javier is raising, plus core issues around content and mitigating harm, plus achieving bold gains in the name of health justice, which everyone's raising in the chat box as well. So are there already perhaps something as simple as a shared document for each of the pillars and the key work stream where we can understand what is on the agenda of upcoming calls and what are some core tenets and expectations at the kind of micro and macro level that communities and civil society support and are fighting for. So we essentially have a lobbying agenda that's transparent and that people can feed into and support.
Just to respond, Asia, I think that's absolutely the critical next step. You know, I think this group has primarily come together initially just to sort of respond to, you know, actually having civil society communities representation as well, and then getting these interim pieces in place, people in place. But you know, that the key next step is to now link with many of the, you know, and perhaps be a connecting point for those reps to all of the ongoing work and the existing work that's already been happening across civil society. You know, there's lots of really important, you know, policy positions already that we can draw on and link to. But yeah, that is definitely the next step, I think.
Great. Thanks to both of you for those important comments. And while you have the Mike, I'm just noting your comment that we should be clear to the heads of agencies that if they don't include us, and to be fair, some seem to be better than others, that in your words, we should go nuclear. And I'd be interested to hear what others think of that. But I mean, I do think that there needs to be a clear message to the heads of agencies that not including civil society isn't a real option. And it seems like the barrier at the moment is in the vaccine pillar, but let's see where that gets to and where the heads of agencies come together. There's also a comment, and again, this is Javier, but I think it's a very valid one, that we're being asked to respond to, with quite detailed feedback in 24 or 48 hours. And while it's a crisis or an emergency, and it doesn't really make for satisfactory consultation with our constituencies. And speaking as again, someone who's a little bit involved, we're in this kind of dual process where we need to ensure adequacy of representation and that the representative of representation, so the right people are there. And at the same time, we kind of also need to do something, because these things are going to run away with us if we're not in there. So that is a real tricky point at the moment. The reality is that these processes just go on at the pace that they do. And so, yes, we're trying our best to make them as representative as possible. And also we're trying our best to respond at all. I'm thinking that we probably need to get close to wrapping up. We have about 5 minutes to go. I wonder if there are people feeling that there are any questions that really need to be answered and have not yet been. I've done my best to go through the list. I might have missed a couple of the latest ones. Would any of the speakers like to respond to anything that has been asked and not yet answered? And if you think that your question hasn't been answered, please just put a quick note in the box now, and we'll be sure to get to it in these last few minutes before we wrap up. Thanks.
So it's Katie. I mean, I think that, one of the things that we have not collectively wrapped our heads around, because we've been sort of, frankly, fighting for access to the various spaces and trying to navigate what's, like a lot of overlapping confusion, frankly, which is, I think, understandable, but also it's not an obvious process about where to go and who to advocate to around getting access even for civil society and communities, right? That's sort of something that individually within the different partnerships people have been sort of, trying to suss out and figure out on their own. But, hopefully we are reaching a point here very soon in the next few weeks to a month where a lot of that kind of settles, and we can turn our attention to the kinds of things that, Asia was raising, and others are the kinds of questions that people are asking around, like, where's the money going, who decides where the money goes, and so on, so that we can have some kind of collective understanding and, essentially, advocacy kinds of documents that help us understand where things are at, what some of the key issues are that are coming up on calls. I know in diagnostics, like, I have a call in in 35 minutes, and I still don't have an agenda for that call, which is a whole of partnership across the diagnostics pillar. Like, there is no agenda. It will be shared when we sit on the call. Like, that's, sort of where things are at right now. So there is a lot of pushing and sort of, sussing out that's still being done. But I think that hopefully over the next, sort of weeks to month, we're able, as civil society and community reps, across these different partnerships and connectors and so on, to be able to find a way to come together collectively and look at those kinds of issues, like what's coming up on the agenda, how do we get input from the broader civil society and community groups, regardless of who's in the seats, interim basis or permanently or whatever. How do we get that input? How do we, find ways to make sure that it's, as broad as possible? So, it's a lot, and it's trying to figure it all out. But this is so helpful to me, you know, sitting within the diagnostics partnership and the work that we've been doing with the civil society reps to see all of the various you know, efforts and different groups and different sort of terms of reference and things. So it's just really helpful, and I hope people feel that this call is helpful in the sense that I hope that we can come back to you all and have sort of another, you know, another call, maybe multiple calls. I don't know, everybody loves calls these days, but yeah, I guess I just sort of final comments for me, I guess, in terms of, you know, just the hopes that people keep sharing ideas and keep sharing connections and keep sharing out what we share out, and we'll get there, and hopefully sooner rather than later. That's it.
Thanks, Katie, and thanks for your terrific efforts to coordinate all of this and herd many of us cats in many directions. I guess we're moving towards final remarks. I know that there are some questions unanswered, and we'll end with sort of next steps and sort of commitments to do next. I do just want to call out one comment question that's come up. I can see Claire Ward has asked, but also other people, because it's a really key one. Is around how do you achieve consistency across the pillars on CSO engagement, and indeed how do the pillars work together? Because if you think about it from a community perspective, communities and organizations, you don't have sort of always separate organizations working on, you know, this group is going to do diagnostics and this group is going to do vaccines and this group is going to do therapeutics. When you're in community, you're in community, and so it's critical that the pillars are working together. It makes no sense to siloize the role of community. Just it makes no sense to put into silos the different modeling for diagnostics and therapeutics and vaccines. And so it's a question we don't really have an answer to, but we're asking quite insistently is, great, you have all these, you know, structures within pillars, but how are the pillars going to work together? And we do hope there'll be some kind of cross-cutting mechanism. So I know that not all of the questions have been answered. Perhaps we can do a few things. We'll take a record of all of this. Perhaps we can commit to attempting to answer all of those questions that weren't answered, which we can do by email, and we can provide a summary of this call. Sorry if I'm putting Katie or anyone else on the spot, but I do think that it would be good if we can answer as many questions as possible. And the second thing is the point that Amy and Mike discussed. I think we need to create a structure so that whoever are the interim representatives for a short period of time have a structure to solicit feedback from broader constituencies. So we can put some effort into figuring out what that looks like so that the conversations are as transparent as possible in the time that we have. And hopefully those structures will continue to the point where we have permanent representatives. So then the third thing that we will do is continue with those efforts to create a transparent process, including through TORs for these roles. And the fourth thing we will do is continue to communicate with you as we hear back from the heads of agencies to find out what the buy-in is from the other side. So those are four clear things that I can think of that we need to take out of this call and move forward. Perhaps the fifth is we'll have another call in, I don't know if it's a fortnight or a month, or we can work out what the right timing is. Katie and others, is there anything else that you think we need to concretely commit to before we wrap up?
No, I think that's a great summary from my side as well, Justin. Thank you.
Great. Any other final comments from any of the speakers before we might even let you go 1 or 2 minutes early?
Hi there, it's Robin. Only to say thanks. Thanks to Katie and to Justin for gathering us together. And thanks to everybody who has made it a priority to be on the call today, and to those who were unable to but will listen to the recording afterwards. It was a really rich discussion, so thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Robin. And I'm sure we all recognize the gravity of the moment, but this really is an opportunity for civil society to show its power. And I'm so grateful for all of you to contributing to this very loud voice that we're going to have. So thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Cheers, all.
We will share a space where we will make the recording of this call and the background documents that were shared as screen shares and make them available to everyone. So, and the other parts that Justin mentioned in terms of a summary and some of the key questions raised. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
You are welcome.
Thank you.